Hello, this is the Politics and Letters podcast. I'm David Barfield with Jim Livingston. And today we're speaking with Greil Marcus, who is the author of many books from Lipstick Traces, he wrote in 1989, to What Nails It in 2024. With Werner Sollers, he edited A New Literary History of America for Harvard University Press in 2009. He has taught at Berkeley, Princeton, Minnesota, the New School, and the Graduate Center in New York. Currently, he lives in Oakland. And with that, Greil, welcome.
Hi, glad to be here.
Well, David and I have thought of this as we didn't think of it originally as a celebration of the 50th anniversary of Mystery Train, your first book that came out in 75. But we would like to make it that, but in the sense that we would like a whole lot more people to know about your work than seem to at present. And so we're gonna make this both a celebration and a and I don't know, a session of proselytization. How's that? We want to spread the word here. David, do you want to start here?
I just had my sort of an intro question, which with respect to the Yale Review piece that you did, which is a sort of it seems like selected segments of the longer essay, What Nails It? And the question that Yale Review, their section is titled, is Why I Write. And I was wondering, when you were attempting to answer this question as somebody who's written for a long time, and it's your livelihood, was this a difficult question to answer initially, or did it just come out like a flood? And the second part of that is, how would you have answered that question over time? Like in the past, was it a sort of a static or consistent reason that you have for writing, or are nowadays different than the past?
Maybe deep in the past, 30, 40 years ago, I might have said, well, I write because I don't know how to do anything else. And that would have been a perfectly honest answer, of kind of incomplete. But there came a time when I found out initially through a television program and then through a writer who got in touch with me, I found out a lot about my own history that had always been shrouded in silence and mystery. I found out how my father, who was killed in the Second World War, how he died, how he lived. My older daughter made contact with the survivors of the ship where he was second in command in the Philippine Sea in December of 1944, when his ship and two others were destroyed by an enormous typhoon. Over 800 men were lost. It was the biggest disaster in the history of the U.S. Navy. And the survivors of his ship, which was called the Hull, had started to hold reunions maybe 20, 30 years after the event. And our older daughter went to one of those reunions, and she met the people who, had the most distinct memories of her grandfather and my father, and who recognized him in her physically. And I always knew that my obsession with the past, my focus on the importance and the unsolvability, but the irrevocable attraction of mysteries, was always at the core of what I did, what I cared about, what impelled me, what led me to make certain connections, what led me on long projects of writing and discovery, not self-discovery, but discovery of things out there in the world and the connections between them, I began to understand more deeply that all of this was simply an inheritance of the mystery into which I was born, and to which finally I was able to receive some real answers. Um, so, when I was asked to write a book about why I write, I knew why I wrote. I'd known that at that point in 2022 for quite a while. And so I had something to write about. And beyond that, I wrote very directly and frankly because one day in 1966, I picked up a paperback of Pauline Kael's first book. I lost it at the movies. That was lying around in the house that I lived in with some other students, and I read it. And never read anything like it. I'd never read anything that was, for me, so thrilling as writing, as critical engagement with a subject that is and isn't yourself. I mean, I was just totally thrilled by this book, and I asked myself, what would it mean to be able to write with as much passion and with such a sense of high stakes and such shamelessness as that person was doing? And I thought, it must feel, you must feel so alive to be able to write the way she was writing in that book. And I want to feel that alive. And so writing was a way of trying to get to the point where I could feel a little bit as alive as Pauline Kael must have felt writing about Shushan, or writing about HUD, or writing about Hollywood, or anything else. And beyond that, I had found and cultivated and pursued certain values about culture and what was important and what wasn't, and what deserved to be celebrated and what deserved to be condemned. And basically, it was a position that the greatest satisfactions, the deepest profundities, the widest ambitions can be found in any form of culture, that the aesthetic satisfactions in Raymond Chandler's detective stories are as great as they are in The Sound and the Fury. That was, an argument. It wasn't an argument. It was a belief. It was a conviction. It was a sense, well, this is how the world looks to me, and it always has looked that way, that divisions in culture were false, that they were a remnant of the class system, and that's all they were, and they were utterly worthless. And one day, some years ago in Venice, we went to the friary. Some art historian friends had told us, in Venice, you got to go there. That's what you have to see. We haven't been there before. And in the friary is a painting by Titian. It's called The Assumption of the Virgin. It's absolutely enormous. I can't remember at the moment how big it is, but it's bigger than you could imagine any painting could or ever should be. And I took one look at it, and it was like being hit by a thunderbolt. And I looked at it from every conceivable angle. I went to the back of the church I looked at it from a great distance. I came up and stood at the foot of the painting and tried to gaze up. It's huge, and you can't see it all at once, but you can somehow apprehend it all at once. And I was there looking at this painting for over an hour, and I kept trying to leave the building, and every time I got to the door, it was like, "One more look. I'll go back for one more look." And, this incredible spell had been cast by this painting. And what it convinced me was that everything I had spent my entire writing life, my life as a critic, all my disbelief in hierarchies and standards, in the notion of great art and low art, and high culture and trash culture, everything was blown apart. And I really said to myself, God, I understand now. The only true art is high art, and the only true high art is religious art, and the only true religious art is Christian art. I say this as someone who's Jewish, who never had any interest in Christianity. And, it was like suddenly being initiated into a cult in about 1 hour. A self-made cult, a self-inflicted cult. Um, and as I say in Why I Write, when I talk about this episode, I said, well, I got over it. But that incident, or to me, which is really an event, what it showed me is that what art really does, and that's my subject. That's what I write about. I write about all kinds of things. That at the heart, oh, there you go.
Yeah, and I lifted it off the, out of your book.
Um, and imagine a very small person at the foot of this enormous painting, much smaller than any of the figures depicted in it, even the little angels in the middle, looking up at this thing. Well, that's what I was doing. But um, what I, you know, what I understood from this incident, this event, was that what art does, what it's about, is completely undermining, breaking down, taking away everything that we think we believe about how the world works, what is right, what is wrong, an imaginative rendering by somebody of how the world looks to them has the power of completely overthrowing how we think the world looks to us. That whatever you think is right, at some point in time, a work of art, whatever it may be, is going to pull the rug out from under you. And that's what it's for. That's what's valuable about it. That's what needs to be sought out and celebrated. The Firesign Theater, wonderful comedy group of the late 60s, whose records I played over and over and over again during the 9 years that I was writing Lipstick Traces. Their, surrealist, cut-up comedy novels. And one of their albums is called Everything You Know Is Wrong. And so I wrote this little book, Why I Write, about how I discovered that was true. Put it that way.
Can I mean, this is so remarkable in so many ways. let me begin with this. Your experience reading Paul and Kale was replicated in my experience reading Mystery Train. I thought, oh my God, you can actually write about like stuff that you actually love and make it real, make it, make it come alive in this way. And in part because it was so clear, it was so obvious. Well, two things. One is that this passionate engagement with the music, but the other, and these might actually be the same thing, is the enormous ambition of the thing. I mean, it was like, I don't know. I mean, in much later, I realized that this book, Mystery Train, was a manifesto for what we now call cultural studies. And this is, I think, what you were getting at, is that it actually doesn't matter what level the art uh, pertains to sociologically or in terms of its ambition. If it's an attempt to create a world elsewhere that you can actually believe in and imagine inhabiting, then okay, then it's art and it's worth commentary. So, all right, with that as a preface, can I read from the author's note of Mystery Train
Sure.
and have you dilate about that? Because um, I mean, I'm an historian, and so me, the phrase that comes to mind is a usable past. That's what I'm trying to get at, and trying to make that accessible to others. But uh, I got a feeling that that's where you're coming from too. But let me read this, because I thought this is the measure, I think, of the ambition in the book and everything that follows. This is at the end of the author's note for Mystery Train. What I bring to this book, at any rate, is no attempt at synthesis, but a recognition of unities in the American imagination that already exist. They are natural unities, I think, but elusive. I learned in the last 2 years that simply because of these unities, the resonance of the best American images is profoundly deep and impossibly broad. I wrote this book in an attempt to find some of those images, but I know now that to put oneself in touch with them is a life's work. Um, yeah, that seems to me to describe the arc of the thing. So, is it possible that you are interested in providing us a usable past? That's certainly the central thread of the book on Like a Rolling Stone. But does that thread, to come back to David's question, I think, is, does that thread actually lead you to what you just called high art? I mean,
No, I have no idea. Um, and a usable past is not a concept that really has any meaning to me. Um, I didn't write Mystery Train or any other book to instruct people, to open doors for people, to lead them through them, um, anything like that. I was I've always been working out my own obsessions, um, with the hunch that if I can write with as much commitment to the subject matter and honesty with myself as I found in Pauline Kael, that that might be interesting to other people. I'm not I didn't write to make the world a better place. Although I think that when people acknowledge what they really like and what they really care about, against all the cultural, institutional, and family constraints to keep them from actually doing that, from recognizing in themselves what they really want, what they really care about. Um, well, that's a good thing to do. If I can help people believe in their own taste, in their own passions. if I can get rid of the notion of a guilty pleasure. Pleasure is hard enough to come by as it is. So no, it's not. I know for a fact that Mystery Train made the past, certain things in the past, more real to certain people. In other words, some people who read the book. And they could then transfer the value that I found, let's say, in Elvis Presley, and that I pushed, and that I celebrated, and that I tried to plumb to whatever depths I could find, that they could then transfer that sense of legitimacy and validation to what they cared about and let that occupy a bigger place in their lives with absolute legitimacy. But with Elvis Presley, it's really why is this singing? Why is this guy singing so different? Why is it so great? And I just wanted to, if not answer that question, make it real. And hundreds and hundreds of times over the years, people have asked me, well, what was it about Elvis Presley that was so special? Was it his looks? Was it his sex appeal? Was it his classic poor boy makes good story? What was it? And I've always had the same answer. What made him special was the way he sang. As if that's a simple thing. It's not a simple thing. That's an infinitely complex statement to make. How did he sing? Why did he sing? How did he sing so differently from anybody else? And on and on and on. You could reduce, let's say, the singing of Jerry Lee Lewis to a mathematical equation. There's a way in which it's enclosed, that it's limited, and that enclosure and those limits lead to extraordinary intensity and cultural reach. But I don't think when you listen to Jerry Lee Lewis, you say, how could anybody do this? And that's what I've always heard in Elvis Presley. So I wanted to affirm that kind of question, that kind of mystery, as a social and aesthetic fact.
David?
Yeah, no, well, and to bring it up to the more recent thing you wrote about, you opened the piece with the Stones album, Let It Bleed. And I was interested in reading your take on it as being somebody who was around when it came out versus my perspective. I was 5 years old at that time. And the way I'm a fairly big Stones fan, but when I look back at the 60s or the late 60s, that the way the Stones, those 4 records that came out in succession, in sequence was Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and Exile on Main Street, right? That segment of, I think, is probably, here's my critic's position, is probably 4, I don't think anyone's ever put out 4 records as great as that in a row. And one of the things you pointed to of the sort of the end of the 60s, of the tumult, social upheaval and so forth that took place, is that it seemed to inform Let It Bleed. And I think to myself, when I'm looking at great art in general, but with American rock and roll or British in particular, is that these artists owe, I guess, a debt of gratitude in a way to social upheaval and social maladies, right? And I'm wondering, is it, this is maybe a weird question, but would it be possible to do great art in social stability? Or is it something that is, because I mean, the Stones are a great example of this, I think. Especially, for me, it was Beggar's Banquet. Um, but even not just rock and roll, but like lots of forms of art kind of rely on a rejection of the status quo, a rejection of oppression or injustice.
Well, yeah, that you're asking two questions. That great art engages with enormously divisive questions in this in the social world of which they're a part. That's one way of putting it. And that kind of engagement often comes in times when those social and political divisions are being fought over by large numbers of people in all different kinds of way. When societies are fighting over a definition of what they are, who belongs, what that society is for, who it's for, and who it's not for. Those kinds of enormous questions, which at the time the records you're talking about were made, were on everybody's mind and impossible not to talk about and impossible not to have an opinion about one way or another. One of the best things ever written about Elvis, at least as I have heard it, is somebody said it was impossible not to have an opinion about him in 1956.
Right.
Wow, what a great thing. Something in the world that everybody has to have an opinion about. Something that everybody has to argue about, has to take a stand, has to plant themselves in one place or another. You can't just say, oh, I don't know, I don't care, haven't heard it, don't know. And those records you're talking about all came out of a time when you had to have an opinion about damn near everything. And the Rolling Stones were no different from anybody else. They had opinions. The world looked a certain way to them. They're trying to work out what that was and why. You know, Keith Richards wrote Gimme Shelter, which I think is the Rolling Stones' greatest recording. And, you know, if I had to go to my grave with it, I'd say the greatest recording anybody ever made. I could name a dozen others, but I'd go with that one if I had to. Keith Richards wrote that song, and he gave a real clear description of writing it in his autobiography, which is in many ways an absolutely terrible book, except when he writes about music, writes about songs. And he said it was a shitty day. He was looking out the window and it was storming, and he was looking at the leaves being blown one way or another. And he started thinking about and imagining people being blown one way or another. And it just seemed like that was what life was. That was what the world was. And that was all there was. A threat and a storm. Now, he didn't connect that to political division, to assassinations, to fear and terror He didn't connect it to the Vietnam War. But all those things fed into it. And they fed into it as people listened to that song.
Yeah.
And they said, oh my God, this is the life I'm living now. But with that song, suddenly with more intensity, with more desperation, with more of a feeling of necessity to escape, engage even more deeply in whatever way you were attempting not to back away from all the choices that were being thrown at you. So that song became a social event in the lives of the people who responded to it. It's not an accident that that song continued to be to appear on the radio ever since. That it has remained at the core of a common frame of reference.
Can I think we've, I mean, the phrase you use in the book on, like a Rolling Stone, just once, but I think it speaks to this, and I think it speaks to David's question too, is that, great art seems to be, produced when societies have reached a verge and the new is palpable and concrete enough for people to have a real stake in it, and yet the disintegrating past is also, still full of, promise, potential, and, something useful. So it's that ambiguity, it seems to me that produces it. So if you read Mystery Train or Invisible Republic, in those ways, then the chapters that lead up to the last chapter in Mystery Train, Presley had, and what leads up to that the moment of the recordings that Harry Smith, collects in the late 20s and 30s is a moment when, and this speaks directly to Presley, I think, when the color line is no longer, or for a moment, is no longer a barrier, but rather, um, something to be played with, to be crossed and then recrossed, to be moved, to be, uh, um, I don't know, questioned. But both sides of that color line, are in play, are at issue. So so to the politics, I think that have been, broached here. Um, when you write about Elvis Presley, you say, "Look, this is not a matter of, an appropriation of black music. This is something that of course has those strands, that cultural, uh, component, but it's more than that. It's greater than the sum of the parts that we call, say, white and black or country and blues. It it's a synthesis that gets us well beyond that." And also with those recordings of the late 20s and 30s that you talk about in Invisible Republic, that people who could play this music, and play it even better than some of the people who recorded it, bought the records even in the absence of a phonograph, because they were totems of this moment when, again, the color line became something that it wasn't just permeable. It was something that was being recreated, but in ways that allowed us to see both sides of it differently. So I guess what I'm asking is, is that where you see the values of this art we call rock and roll? And is there a politics that comes up, that resides in, this thing we call the color line?
I don't know how to answer those questions. I mean, those questions, you quoted that thing where I said at the end of the author's note in Mystery Train that I wrote in 1974, that to put oneself in touch with these kinds of questions is a life's work. Well, it is a life's work, and I'm not dead yet.
Okay.
I don't
We're
know.
glad for that.
I don't know the answers. Those are questions, they're still alive to me. But there comes a point in any artist's life when they say to these kinds of questions, these kinds of, do I have the right to engage with that person's culture? Does that person's culture have the right to so infect me with ambition and desire that really it's a kind of disease and ought to be stamped out? Why am I so moved by this? How can I express this? Do I have the right to express it in a way that maybe is just trying to step into somebody else's skin? Isn't that a crime? What we find in art, in 78s or 45s or any recordings that were left behind over the last 100 years, is all kinds of people saying, fuck it, I have to play this song. I have to write this song. I have to sing it. I have to write this book. I have to paint this face. I have to do it. The only person who can stop me is me. And right now I'm going to do everything I can to win the war against the part of myself that tells me, no, don't do this. You have no right. You're not good enough. It doesn't belong to you. It moves me. It's part of me. Of course it belongs to me. When that answer bursts out. And so I don't know what Doc Boggs thought. Living in a part of Eastern Virginia in a mining town, working as a miner because it's the only work available to anybody. Not wanting to be a miner, playing his banjo, hearing other singers, listening to female blues singers recording in New York City in the mid-20s, listening to their 78s and being moved and saying, my question reading Pauline Kael in 1966 when I discovered her was, what would it feel like to be as alive as this person had to be as engaged with what she was writing about as she so clearly was? What would it mean to feel that alive? And Doc Boggs, a white man in his 20s, is listening to female blues singers from New York City and saying to himself, what would it feel like to speak the truth so plainly? To be as honest with yourself as this woman had to be to make this sound that is so affecting me and making me feel smaller and bigger at the same time. Smaller because I can't do what she does, and bigger because I so want to do what she does. I want to feel the way she had to feel when she said, my man isn't here. He's never coming back. My man isn't here. He's never coming back. That's the way it is, and there's nothing you can have to change it. Singing a blues verse that cuts to his heart and saying, I want to feel the way she did. I want to feel as alive as she had to feel. And in some secret way that maybe he's not even expressing to himself, I want to make other people feel that way too. I want to wreck their lives as much as she's wrecked mine. In other words, she's exposed the poverty of my life, all that I can't say and don't have the nerve to. That shows me what I could be, and I'm not. So, that's the adventure. That's the politics. That's the communication.
Wow. Yeah. I think I agree. It sounds right. David, did you have a follow-up
Go
here?
ahead. Well, actually, just very briefly, I lifted something that you wrote, I guess, 50 years ago about, what was this guy's name? I've forgotten it. Oh, Harmonica Frank.
Like a
Mhm.
Frank.
I'll quote you here, although it's an old quote now, but I think it speaks to the political a little bit. What matters about Frank is the sense of freedom he brought to his music, a good-natured contempt for conventional patterns of life, combined with a genius for transforming all that was smug and polite into absurdity. The result was a music of staggering weirdness, dimly anchored by the fatalism of the blues and powered by the pure delight of what was soon to be called rock and roll. Which to me, it's like at its core political, right? That impulse to reject it's almost it read like the first thing that came to mind was Moliere, right? This was the this is sort of what I meant by the refutation of the status quo, I guess. And I sort of thought that was, at least I always took rock and roll in its origins and as what kids say to their parents when they're going to go to the show or whatever, that this is for us. This is for um, a new way of thinking about things. Um, that was just sort of my comment about the need to push aside what's happening, or the political and social reality in rock, in rock and roll. Anyway,
Well,
I don't know if
yeah.
there's an actual question. That was kind of where I was coming from.
Yeah, and in that chapter about Harmonica Frank, this character from Mississippi who really traveled all over the United States, was so proud that he was once on television in Los Angeles, um, did every kind of job. He was a carnival barker. He dug ditches. He picked fruit. He played in medicine shows from the 20s on into the 50s, and even after that. Played his last shows in the 70s, was invited to national folklore events in Washington, D.C. by the end of his life. Someone who taught himself to read and write, taught himself to read music, who, when I was sent tapes of his very few records that he had made in the 50s, no one had ever heard of him. I'd certainly never heard of him. One of the reasons I wrote about him was I thought, I'm going to write about this character, about this singer, this performer, and nobody's going to be able to criticize what I say about him because no one will have ever heard of him or heard of him.
Same here.
I'm free. But in that chapter about Harmonica Frank, there's a fantasy about him being kept on a sinecure as a kind of cultural icon and cultural pet on LBJ's ranch. And I draw a parallel between certain aspects of LBJ's life and his character and his personality to Harmonica Frank. And, I'm writing this in 1973, 1974, when Lyndon Johnson is still, a curse word, a pariah, um, um, a man who led the country into ruin. And, I'm trying to imagine LBJ listening to Harmonica Frank saying, yeah, that's me. That's me. I know what that's all about. Um, Harmonica's Frank's great manifesto was, I told him my name was on the tail of my shirt. In other words, kiss my ass.
Right.
And I imagine LBJ saying, that's all I've ever wanted to tell people. I tried to get that across. Culture leads you it leads you to strange places, where you don't necessarily want to be, or never imagined you would want to be. It leads you to say things that go against what you consider to be your deepest beliefs, but in fact are true to your deepest instincts and desires.
Well, with that in mind, with the sort of the promiscuity, if you will, of culture, that once you produce something, you have no idea what it's gonna, who it's gonna affect, how it's gonna affect them, what its effects might be. So I keep coming back to those moments in Invisible Republic. Um, the subtitle of which is Bob Dylan's Basement Tapes, and it's sort of about Harry Smith, but it's mainly, I think, about the what I take you to be saying is a cultural revolution of the late 20s and 30s, driven by the electrification, the amplification, and the mechanization of music. Um, and to me, so I immediately think two things, because I'm an historian, it's a professional deformation. I think, well, that allows me or leads me to question this idea that it's the commercialization of music which taints it, which corrupts it, which makes it, um, you know, we shouldn't be going there because that commodifies it and therefore it ruins it in some way, it corrupts it. But I think, at least implicitly, the argument of Invisible Republic is that it's precisely the commercialization through mechanization, electrification, and so forth that allows for this color line to be ignored, as Doc Boggs would do, say, as the country singers who covered so-called blues songs did, and vice versa. Um, and that, of course, I mean, the politics of that argument are fraught. So if I can fast forward then to the I think that the conflict at the heart of the movie about Dylan going electric at Newport in '65. Do you, how do you see this? Am I overreading or underreading you in in those moments in Invisible Republic, and how then would we map the argument, whether for or against, onto that the sequence at issue in that movie, which I, of course, actually liked a lot. But I think you didn't. But anyway,
Well, I mean, with that movie, look, it's an old story told and retold, mystified, demystified
right.
for what now, 60 years since double, triple, quadruple scare quotes around Dylan Goes Electric. I found, it's a story fixed in stone, regardless of what anybody might think they've done to clear it up, to tell the truth. It's a story that's fixed in stone. It's a cultural myth. It's an imprisoning myth, like all myths can be. It's not a liberating myth. And, to me, it was, while it was sticking to that ideological story, the first half, the question, should I do this? Should I make this break? Should I take this great leap? I found that just extraordinarily tiresome, and I was really getting sick of everybody on the screen. Um, and then this imp comes into the movie. This actor, I'm forgetting his name, but he did a marvelous job playing Bob Newirth, who for a time in 64, 65 was Bob Dylan's sidekick. Someone he trusted, a sounding board, a Mr. Fix-It. And this is a guy who just doesn't give a damn about what anybody thinks. And that really comes across in the movie. And it opens the movie up. And it essentially says, let's do this because it sounds great. I haven't played an electric guitar since I was 16 years old. I remember how great it used to make me feel. I want to feel that way again. But I can play better now, and I can feel even more than I did then. And I can have all these people around me making noises that I've never heard before, just in my head, and I want to try to live up to that. I want to be able to play like Mike Bloomfield standing next to me. And again, that impulse, that instinct that I keep talking about. I see Bob Dylan saying, I want to feel the way Mike must feel when he's making that sound. Nobody could feel more alive than anybody who's making a sound like that. I want to feel that alive. There are a lot of rock and roll records. There are really quite a few with the title I'm Alive. And it's somebody wanting to announce themselves to the world and say, look at me, I'm here, I have something to say. Nobody like me was here before, nobody like me will be here when I'm gone. But also just for the pleasure of letting that out. You make a record and it's just full of life and you're saying, I'm alive. And somebody says, you're alive? So what? I said, this is what. Listen to this. And you say, God, I don't feel that alive. I wish I did. That's what begins to happen in the movie when Bob Newirth comes into it. And that becomes the adventure. Can you get there? And Timothy Chalamet, who I always thought of as just a model, not an actor, he got there.
Yeah.
And pulled me along. And a lot of other people too. But, it's not, it's set up as a political drama. And
Right.
the answer to it isn't political. It isn't personal either. It's aesthetic. What does it take to put a song like a Rolling Stone into the world? What does it take emotionally? What does it take spiritually? What does it take culturally? And what does it take as work in the studio, trying to find that song with a bunch of musicians banging it out and the song not working and falling apart and just never getting there? When I wrote a book about Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone, I found out very early I wanted to ask Dylan about the recording session. I didn't want to ask him what the song meant or why he wrote it or anything like that. I just wanted to ask about how it was recorded. And I was told, well, Bob doesn't really remember much about that, doesn't really want to talk about it. But hey, I can let you listen to a tape of the entire recording session. Oh, really? That, that was a long time ago. That was in 2005. All of that has since been released, and any of us can listen to that anytime. At the time, nobody had heard that. And I was just beside myself. Oh my God, I'm going to listen to this whole session. God, what wonders lie in store. And I knew right then that whatever this book I was writing turned out to be, the end of it would just be a transcription of whatever went on in that session. Well, I got it. They sent me a CD of the entire session, and I listened to it again and again. I was just completely shocked because over the course of 2 days, in 16, 18 attempts to record this song, they get it one time. And when they get it, they don't know that. And they keep trying, and it keeps falling to pieces. When they finally get the recording that we all know, somewhere in the second day, like many takes into the second day, what's so extraordinary is that up to that point, this is a song with 4 verses. They have never gotten through more than 2 verses. Every time they get through 1 verse or maybe 2 verses, somebody hits a wrong note, somebody sings the wrong line, the rhythm falls apart, and they have to stop and they have to start again. And when they finally get on the train, and the train keeps going, and they get to the 3rd verse, and they get to the 4th verse, you realize that all these musicians in the studio who are trying to play this song, they never heard the 3rd verse. They've never heard the 4th verse. They don't know how many verses the song has. It might have 6. It might have 17. This is all absolutely unknown territory. And they're steaming ahead as if there's just no way to stop. And at the end of it, the producer says, oh, boy, that was great. I forget exactly his words, but, he clearly responds. And then he says, okay, take 17. And they do it again, and they can't get past the 2nd verse. Then they do it again, and they can't get past the 1st verse. And you realize the contingency involved in what we now look back to as a cultural turning point. They came very close to never making this record at all. And it never existing except on some old piece of tape that was filed and forgotten as an experiment that never worked. That's what's shocking about it. And yet, so many different kinds of energy, so many different kinds of will and desire and wish on the part of a lot of different people go into creating this moment where something is less made than found. You put yourself in the middle of a process where discoveries are made, and it's up to you to recognize when they've happened, if they do.
Wow. Well, if I've ever heard a closing statement, I think I did just now, but we can proceed if you'd like and do another take.
Another tape?
Take, another
Uh,
take.
Well, just on that general topic, if you've ever heard Dylan's bootleg series that he put out of different variations of songs, some of them are so much better than the ones they originally published. Just in my opinion, but he's sort of known for never wanting to do it the same way twice. So I think that's to his credit in that respect.
I always felt, when they put out the first bootleg series, I think they're now up to number 17 or something like that. One from Robert Polito once had the idea of writing a history of Dylan's career based only on music he never released when it was made. Um, the other, the other Dylan, the other career, the invisible career. I wish he'd written that book. But when the first bootleg series came out, I think it was in sometime in the 1980s. There was a song on it that no one had heard before, Blind Willie McTell, that Dylan recorded with Mark Knopfler, the guitarist for Dire Straits. And clearly, when you listen to this, it's an unfinished recording. It's not even exactly a rehearsal. It's an attempt to put the song together, to find the song.
Right.
And yet the unshapeliness of it, the fact that it isn't finished, brings out the most extraordinary passion from Dylan as a singer. He's written the words, he's got the words there, but what the song is, what kind of shape it's going to take, if it takes any shape at all, how far it's going to go, can it get its message across? Its message that nobody can sing the blues like Blind Willie McTell, that there are aesthetic experiences out there in the world that will shock you and scare you and take away all your deepest beliefs and change you and leave you forever unsatisfied. That's the subject of the song too. What Blind Willie McTell did to me showed me that they're lands I'll never reach, their satisfactions I'll never know. The great blues singer Skip James recorded in 1930, and he was discovered by blues searchers in a hospital in Tunica, Mississippi in 1964. And then he performed at the Newport Folk Festival, shocked everybody with his song, Devil Got My Woman. And then he began to tour folk clubs and coffee houses and folk festivals around the country. And after one show in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he's sitting in his dressing room backstage with a couple of other people, and a kid comes in, somehow gets in. Maybe there's nobody blocking anybody, just walks in, sits down next to Skip James, picks up his guitar. The effrontery of it is just overwhelming. And he plays a Skip James riff on the guitar. And he says, "Mr. James, will I ever be able to play like you play?" And Skip James, who was an acerbic, dark character, turns to the kid and says, "Skip has been and gone from places you will never get to." And that is the feeling that can take over any aspiring creative person. You you read Faulkner, you listen to Bessie Smith, whatever it might be, and you say, I don't want to feel the way they had to have felt to do what they did. I want to go as far as they went. And I can't even finish The Sound and the Fury, I can't even listen to the end of Empty Bed Blues without turning away with an understanding of all that I'll never be able to achieve. So you feel at once inspired and defeated. And that's the motor of creativity. So I sort of forgot how we got there and what we started with. But I think that my attempt at an answer to it, whatever it was, yeah, we were talking about the bootleg series and, songs that were never released. I always believed that the reason Bob Dylan didn't release Blind Willie McTell, which might be his greatest recording, it's a record, it's just being played on acoustic guitars, and you just want to turn it up and make it louder and louder and louder, as if it can say more the louder it gets. I've always felt he didn't release that record on the album that it would have been included on, whether it was, I forget, Infidels or Oh Mercy, is because it would have exposed how completely hollow and worthless everything around it was.
Well,
Can't put this out. It's going to
Infidel-
show what a complete fraud 90% of what I do is.
It is a great recording. My God.
Yeah.
one of my favorites is Infidels. That I listen to that pretty regularly. That was with Knopfler too, right? He produced that record.
Yeah.
Infidels.
Yeah. It was Infidels that it didn't go on to.
Yeah. Well, here's to multiple, right? Well, listen, thank you so much for coming and
Yeah.
coming up with our vague questions.
No.
I thought they were pretty pointed, actually.
No, this was great. And I really appreciate your taking the time wanting to do this. It's always fun for me to engage in these subjects and, you know, try and say why they still matter to me so much.
Well, I'd say you said it pretty good.